So welcome everyone, and we are here today to start the session for the 1st July that we had planned the second part of our series of webisode. Today we are going to talk about AAC for individuals with autism and developmental disabilities. And with us, we have a very special person, Janie Cirlot-New. She's a speech therapist from the Center of AAC and Autism, staying at Mississippi, US. So welcome, Janie. And over to you to start this wonderful session with us. Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, I'm delighted to be here. And like she said, our session is sort of an introduction to augmentative communication. And just so you'll kind of have an idea of who I am a speech language pathologist, and I tell people I've been a speech pathologist longer than I've not been a speech pathologist. And have really focused on augmentative communication most of my career, which spans over 40 years. And I am a contract employee of the Center for AAC and Autism, and I do receive equipment to do presentations with. And our American Speech and Hearing Association says that we have to disclose those kind of things when we first start a presentation, just so you'll know. And so anyway, my background is speech language pathology. I worked in public schools for a while, but I've spent most of my career at universities, at 2 different universities. And I have been doing augmentative communication for well over 30 years. And that's not to say that I have all the answers, because I don't, but I do have a real passion for individuals who are non-speaking and helping them be able to learn to communicate. And so augmentative communication is, next to my granddaughters, is one of my favorite topics. So just so you'll know, our learning objectives for today are that participants will be able to identify individuals who would benefit from augmentative communication intervention. You should be able to describe 3 implementation strategies for emerging communicators. And when I say emerging communicators, I mean individuals who are really learning to expressively communicate for the first time. And then you should also be able to describe the benefits of using speech generating devices, especially those using a unique and consistent motor pattern. And we'll talk more about that as we go along as well. So I think if we're going to talk about augmentative communication, a good place for us to start is to start with communication. So what is communication? And communication is really how we share information and how we take in information and process that information so that we can interact with others. And so that also begs for us to talk about, why do we communicate? And research shows us that we communicate basically for 2 reasons. We communicate in order to have control. We communicate to interact with other individuals. And years ago, when I first started teaching augmentative communication, I read an interesting chapter about adult individuals who had mostly lived in institutions for all of their life. They had never had a way to really interactively communicate because they were non-speaking. Many of them had conditions like cerebral palsy. And as adults, they received voice output devices, computers that they could push a button and it would communicate for them. And so one of them was interviewed that really kind of stuck out in my mind. And they were interviewing this individual who had gotten this device later in life. I think he was in his 40s. And they said, well, what is one of the best things about having a voice output communication system? What's the best thing about that you have that now? And he said, well, he said, I never have to eat potatoes again. It was kind of like I just kind of scratched my head. And what he said was, though, he said that somewhere along the way, somebody decided that he liked potatoes and he didn't have a way to say no, he didn't. And so they served him potatoes all the time. And he said, I'd really rather have macaroni and cheese. So when you think about that from a control standpoint, being able to communicate gives you choices. You can decide what you want to eat. You can decide the music you want to listen to, the clothes you want to wear. So that's a really important reason for being able to communicate. And then the other reason that individuals communicate is so they can have interactions with other people. And so when they looked at reasons why people want to interact with others, Janice Light did a study back in the 80s to say, okay, what is it? Why do we want to be able to interact with other individuals? And what they found in their research was that we interact with other people for 4 main reasons. And the first one was communication of wants and needs. And I think everybody knows that. I think as a young therapist, when I was working with individuals who needed augmentative communication, my go-to always was to give them vocabulary so that they could get their wants and needs met. So that, that was important. And then we also in that research found that another reason that individuals want to interact is so that they can transfer information. Let me just tell you what I did last weekend, or let me share with you what I'm going to do this afternoon when school's out. So transferring information from one person to another. Another reason that we interact with others is for social closeness. And when we talk about social closeness, we're talking about being able to create relationships with other people, to establish those relationships and maintain those relationships over time. And then the last reason for interaction is for social etiquette. And those are the please and thank yous of the world, being able to, say, excuse me, or, pardon me, I didn't hear what you said. So those are the 4 main reasons that we all interact. And, and I know it's hard to answer a question in this, but think about it. Which one of those 4 do you think is the reason that people most often interact with others? And what I find, and I bring this up a lot when I'm teaching augmentative communication, and invariably people always say, well, the reason that we most want to interact with other people is to get our wants and needs met. And that's actually not the number 1 reason people interact. People interact because they want social closeness. They want to establish relationships with people. They want to have friends. They just want to have relationships with people. And to me, that was very powerful when, because I've been practicing for 10 years before I knew that this was really the reason that most people wanted to interact. And so when looking at augmentative communication, which we're going to get into here in just a second, I realized that the way I was presenting vocabulary and communication skills to individuals that were non-speaking, that I really needed to change my focus from not just wants and needs, but social closeness as well. How do I give individuals vocabulary that will help them build relationships with other people? Because that's one of the most important reasons that we interact. And that's what that research shows. So I think that's really important for us to think about as we think about how we're going to implement augmentative communication. All right, and along with this too, so what is language? Well, language is using words in a structured and conventional way. Okay, it's the rules that govern how we put words together, what endings we use, and that kind of thing. So when we think about that, we think about language and communication. Well, how do language and communication actually develop? Well, what we know is that when typically developing young children, when they first start learning to communicate, they begin to get some receptive language. They hear people talking and using words around them and that kind of thing. And then at some point, they start producing words or word approximations. So let's say that little baby is laying in a crib and they put their lips together and out comes the word mama. Okay. And that's probably, that may not be the word that individuals in India use to call their mom, but in America that is. And so out comes the word mama. So what happens then? They say mama, and this person comes over and squeals and picks them up and plays with them, and they like it. And so then it's like, well, I'm gonna try that again. Let's put my lips back together and say that again. So they have a unique and consistent way of saying that word, mama. and they hear the same thing every time they put their lips together. And when they use that unique and consistent motor pattern, they hear that auditory signal, and then something happens and they like it, that helps them learn what that word means. So then after a little while, you know, they practice saying mama, they're beginning to think, you know, that person's going to come over and play with me if I say that. Then they say another word like dad. And then a different person comes over and probably even plays with them in a little bit different way. But again, they have a unique and consistent motor pattern to be able to say the word dad. They have the auditory signal, which sounds the same every time they put those sounds together. And then the same person comes over to play with them, which is different from one mama. So that's how we learn language. We start saying words, and then what happens when we say those words shapes that understanding of what those words mean. And then we also know that individuals learn single words first, and then they learn to put words together as they get more and more words. Typically, individuals need to be able to produce between 50 and 75 words before they put words together to make phrases. And so we want to be sure that we introduce individuals to communication systems that allow them to develop a rich single word vocabulary. Okay, so that's communication and language. And I think it's important for us to kind of all be on the same page to think about language and communication. And then we'll step into what is augmentative communication. And what we know about individuals all individuals, but specifically individuals who have disabilities, is that they probably have, in 90% of the time, have some way of communicating. Now, it may be gestures, it may be eye gaze, maybe body language, but everybody has some natural ability to communicate. But many times individuals are unable to develop words. And so augmentative communication is when we supplement an individual's natural ability to communicate. And we want to use that, whatever it is we're going to use to help supplement their natural ability. We want to be able to allow individuals to independently communicate. We want them to be able to communicate their wants and needs. We want them to be able to share information. We want them to be able to use that communication to develop friendships, relationships with other people. And so that's really important. So in America, we often refer to augmentative communication as AAC. Sometimes we even call it AugCom. So if those words pop in, it's actually all the same thing, though. So augmentative and alternative communication. Originally, when we first started using that term, augmentative meant that we were supplementing someone's natural ability. They may have some words and we're going to add to that. And then alternative would be when someone had no speech at all and they use that as an alternate form of communication. But we've kind of just, now it's just sort of one thing, and it's AAC or augmentative communication. We don't necessarily distinguish the difference so much. But in general, it is allowing individuals to be able to improve their ability to communicate whatever their natural abilities are. All right, so who benefits from augmentative communication? And that is going to be individuals who are non-speaking or individuals who have limited speech as well. And the individuals can be non-speaking or have limited speech for a variety of reasons. It could be a congenital condition such as cerebral palsy or autism or cognitive deficits. It could be something that is acquired. It could be a cerebral vascular accident or a stroke. It could be a traumatic brain injury. It could be a condition that is progressive, such as ALS or Lou Gehrig's disease, Parkinson's disease, or could even be something temporary, such as having surgery or if you have a voice disorder. And right now I think about too, I worked in a hospital for a short period of time, but haven't in a long time, but I've thought a lot about individuals who have COVID-19 or have the virus now and who are being intubated. And I think about how that's going to interrupt their ability to communicate. And so hopefully those individuals are going to have some form of temporary augmentative communication to be able to communicate to their caregivers as well. But our presentation today is really going to focus on the congenital aspects that may cause an individual to be non-speaking or to have limited speech. But also remember, because we're going to talk mostly about children and people who are going to be beginning communicators, but that might also include some acquired disabilities as well, because developmental disabilities in America is considered a condition that happens before you're an adult. So you could have an individual, a child who's had a stroke or a traumatic brain injury as well. But really, augmentative communication is for any individual who is non-speaking or who has limited speech, regardless of what their disability is. But it is important for us to know what their disability is, because that often helps determine what system of augmentative communication might be most appropriate for them. We'll talk a little bit about that later. So augmentative and alternative communication actually comes in two forms. One is unaided AAC and the other is aided. Unaided AAC means that a person's not going to use something that is not that they don't already have with their body. So that's going to be sign language, gestures, that sort of thing. It's not going to be an outside piece of technology. And when I say technology, that can be anything from low tech to high tech. And we'll talk a little bit about that. But obviously, aided augmentative communication is when you're using something outside of the body to help you be able to be an effective communicator. So like I said, when we're looking at aided language, we categorize them in three different ways. We usually look at low tech, mid tech, and then high tech. And while low tech is important, you're going to see, you'll find out pretty quickly that I really am, I'm more of a high tech person, but I've become that way over a long period of time as well. But anyway, low tech is generally non-powered. And so that is going to be picture boards or letter boards. It could be a notebook or a binder that has picture symbols in it to help an individual communicate. Could be something like a keychain. Many times a child will have a keychain that has pictures on it that they can easily carry and communicate with as well. It includes the picture exchange system, which is commonly known as PECS, where you take a picture and utilize it to communicate to an individual as well, with the caveat too that picture exchange also can be on an iPad as well. And then POD is another low-tech communication system that was originally created for individuals who had significant physical disabilities. But these are all low-tech augmentative communication platforms. Next is mid-tech, and mid-range technology usually has digitized speech, and digitized speech is not the same as computer-generated speech, which is synthesized speech. Digitized is more like recorded speech. And so the downside of recorded speech is that it takes up a lot of memory. And it also means that if you really want an individual to have single words to communicate with, it's going to be difficult to do that, because if you record, let's say you had a device that had 32 locations on it, 32 places for messages, and you wanted to do single words. If you record those words individually on each one of those buttons, when you get ready to put words together to make phrases, because you recorded it digitally, those words are still going to sound like they're individual, which, you know, I hope that makes sense. It's kind of difficult to explain, but it's still going to sound like if you recorded the word won't, you said won't and more, and recorded more on a different button. When you try to put those together to make a phrase like we do when we use natural speech, it's not going to sound like a phrase. It's going to sound like two separate words. And so that's the downside of using digitized speech. But my thought too is it's better than no speech at all. But these are just some of the mid-tech devices that are out there. And my list on either one are not complete. It's not all there is, because there are a lot of different devices. But a Tech Talk is a mid-tech device that has digitized speech. You can get 8 location, you can get 32 locations. Partner 4 is a digitized device that has 4 buttons on it. A Go Talk is another series that you can get that has, 9, 16, has different numbers of cells or buttons that you can have to put messages on as well. My experience with mid-tech is that it is not conducive to actual interactive communication because it is so limited. You just don't have a lot of, you can't generate novel messages with it the way you can a device that is a more high-tech system. So next is high-tech augmentative communication, and that is going to be a computerized or computer-based system. Generally, they have both digitized and synthetic speech. Synthetic speech is computer-generated speech, and there are a lot of different synthesized speech modes out there. When we first started having voice output devices that had synthesized speech, the speech was very robotic sounding, but it's getting, it's better, it's more natural sounding now. But some of the devices that are available that have high-tech, that are considered high-tech, are the Accent series. The Accent series is a series produced by the Print Curament Company here in America, and there's an 800, a 1000, and a 1400. They're really similar, they're the same device, it's just different sizes. An 800 is 8 inches, a 1000 is 10 inches, and 1400 is 14 inches. And that is because different people need different sizes. If you have a child who's going to carry their device, obviously a smaller device might be more appropriate as opposed to one that's 14 inches and weighs more. But that's a series that is a high-end communication system. There's also an I-series that is by Tobii Dynavox. And again, they come in different sizes. So if an individual needs a small as opposed to a large one, the same. Touch Chat is also a device that is produced in the United States as well. And then under high tech, you also have iPad with augmentative communication apps, and that can be Words for Life, it can be Proloquo to Go, Sonoflex. Most of the major companies have apps that you can purchase for communication as well. And there's also, even though I'm talking about low tech, mid tech, and high tech, there really is some blurring of the lines there because of the technology we have. So you can actually, even on an iPad, you can have a very simple communication system that may only have 4 or 8 pictures or whatever. So just know that even while it is an electronic device and is computer-based, you still can have a simple system if you need it as well. And on some of them, like on the Accent series, Words for Life is a communication vocabulary system that I use actually quite a lot, and it has the option to have 84 symbols showing at one time, but if that's too much for a child or an individual that you're working with, you can actually hide some of those symbols, so you can start out simple and then add vocabulary as you go, so that it gets, you can add more and more vocabulary and it becomes more sophisticated as the individual uses it over time. Okay. All right. So I think it's very important when you're looking at augmentative communication to have a good evaluation to help determine which system is going to be most appropriate for an individual. Generally, this evaluation is going to be done by a team of people. And it may be that team of people doesn't come together all at one moment, but they would have they would share in the choosing of the communication system, okay? Some of the team members that might be available on an augmentative communication evaluation or assessment team would be, hopefully most of all, you're gonna have a speech language pathologist, but a speech language pathologist who has knowledge of a wide variety of communication devices and systems to help make wise decisions about what's most appropriate. But it certainly would include, when we're talking about children, would include the parents, depending on the age of the individual. The individual is always going to be a part of the team. How they give input is going to be different depending on where they are as far as their communication abilities are. But it could include a psychologist. It could include an occupational and or physical therapist as well. The teacher, if they're in schools as well. So your team is going to depend on the individual and what kind of support they may need. But everybody can give information, give some input during the evaluation process. So one of the first things that you want to look at in the evaluation process is you want to look at the current communication abilities of the individual you're working with. What is it they can do? You know, do they have some receptive language skills? Do they have, you know, what does their expressive language look like? Do they have any words? If they don't have words, are they using gestures, or, you know, are they using eye gaze? Do they turn to look at something that they want, even if they can't say what they want? Are they reaching out and pointing to it, or you know, trying to grab what it is they want? So you want to really look at their ability to communicate already and what's working for them and what's not working for them. You know, do they have a clear form of being able to accept or reject something? You know, do they have a yes or no that most individuals can understand? But you want to look at what their current communication skills are. And then you want to look at what their communication needs are. And this is always listed when you're looking at, you know, all of the pieces of a good augmentative communication evaluation. But to me, the answer to that is always the same. What we truly want for individuals is for them to be able to have a rich single word vocabulary so that they can put words together to say what they want to say, not what somebody else wants to say. So we want everybody to be able to generate novel messages. You know, if you look at a communication system that is all phrases or sentences, you know, if you can say, push one button and say, I want a cookie, but what if you really wanted a potato chip and you don't have a button to say, I want a potato chip? So it really, to me, is more important to have single words. And remember, too, the way individuals develop language from the very beginning is single word vocabulary. We don't develop phrases and then go back and learn the words that are in them. We learn words first. So to me, the communication need for everyone is to have a rich single word vocabulary that allows them to be able to generate novel messages to say what they want to say. Okay. Sorry, that's a little bit of a soapbox for me, but I really do believe we need to give individuals lots of words so that they can communicate what they want to. All right. And then you're actually going to look at the augmentative communication systems and technology. What is available? What is going to work best for this individual? And like I said before, I really am a firm believer in voice output devices. I have practiced for a long time. I was practicing teaching individuals to communicate long before we had high-tech communication systems. So I did sign language. I've even used tape recorders with messages on it where they would just push the button to turn the message on and say that word as well. And having studied as a speech language pathologist, I knew that we develop language by single words. But then I found myself, as I started using technology, I found that I immediately started going to full phrases instead of single words. So if I had one of the first pieces of technology we would use a language master, which was just a piece of equipment that had a card you could send through it, and it would actually record it as if you were recording it on an old-timey tape recorder. I don't know if anybody remembers what those are. And what happened was, though, I had room on that card to put a whole sentence. So instead of just putting cookie or just putting drink, then I would put the whole message, I want a cookie or I want a drink. And so the individual would then choose which card they wanted and run it through the machine, and it would say what they wanted. And it didn't take me very long to realize that I had actually gone completely away from the way we develop language. We develop language in single words, but here I was having my non-speaking students produce a whole word on this technology that we had. And so then I had to go in search of technology that would allow these individuals to have single words so they could put those words together to say what they want to say. So anyway, that's why I'm a big proponent of voice output, because I think it is more, it's more natural. It's more like what we do with our voice. So why not, if we can have that available for our students, have it available. But anyway, there are lots of systems out on the market. And I think that if you're in the evaluation process, that it's important for you to have an understanding of as many of those devices as you can, if you're the therapist or the team member who is making decisions about which device is most important. And I think it's important for that individual to be able to articulate why one system might be better than another system for the individual that you're looking at. Okay, so, but anyway, the next part would be looking at the system and the technology. And then you want to look at, how is it going to be instructed? How are we going to teach this individual how to use this communication system? And what we know, what happens in the United States all the time, is that we may have an individual who goes to a place to have an evaluation for an augmentative communication device. The device is recommended, they get it paid for, and then they give it to the teacher or the therapist, and it's like, here you go. And what they don't receive many times is the instruction that they need in order to teach that individual how to use that device. So a real important piece is looking at how training is going to happen, so that the individual who's going to use the system, but also the families and the therapists, have the training they need to be able to implement the instruction for the communication system as well. And that is a key point that needs to always be addressed when you're looking at what system to use. And then the last part of the augmentative communication is the evaluation of the outcomes. You know, it's not, we're not just going to recommend a device and then give it to them and they be on their way. We've got to look at, you know, after they've been using it for a while, if we provided all of the right instruction that we need to the people that are going to support them, then how is it working for them? Are they making strides? Are they able to use that communication system to interactively communicate with people? And if not, what can we do? So the evaluation process actually is an ongoing process. Yes, you're in the beginning going to identify a device that you think is most appropriate or a system that's most appropriate for them, but it may change over time. So you want to be sure that you are always going back and evaluating, going, okay, is this getting us in the right direction? Are we doing what we need to be able to do? Okay. All right, so an augmentative communication system is going to come with some kind of language. And I think this, to me, is what makes devices very different, okay? What you want to be sure is that your individual has access to single words. And I know you've heard me say it, you're going to hear me say it over and over because I think it's that important. They need to be able to generate phrases and sentences. And once your individual has developed language and can put words together to make phrases and sentences, you may go back and have places where you actually program whole phrases that are very common for that individual to be able to say. But you don't want to do that until they have a good grasp of single words and being able to put words together to make phrases and sentences. You also want to, at some point, be able to have a keyboard or spelling available for the individual. Obviously, if you're working with a preschooler, a keyboard for a 3-year-old is not going to be as important as a keyboard for a 12-year-old or, you know, even a 9-year-old kind of thing. But when you're looking at a system, you want to be sure that you have access to all of these. And one of the things that the Center for AAC and Autism is really all about is having a system that has a unique and consistent motor pattern for every word. You know, when we're talking about developing language earlier, when we use our mouth to articulate a word, when we put all those sounds together, one word comes out, and only that word with the unique and consistent motor pattern that we're producing with our mouth. And so to me, it makes more sense to have a system, a language system that allows an individual to do that. If we're working with someone who needs augmentative communication, it's because their mouth can't produce words the way ours does. And so in this case, then the hand becomes the articulator. When an individual can't use their mouth to produce that word, but they can push a button on the communication system to say a word, then that's how they're articulating. So to me, it makes sense that a system would have a unique and consistent motor pattern so that you push a button and it says the word, and every time you push that button, you're going to hear the same word. And that's going to be different from a system where you go from screen to screen to screen. So if you're using a system where you have to swipe to get to a different screen or a different page, then you're not going to be able to have a unique and consistent motor pattern for it. And so in a little bit, I'll go back and pull up a system and demonstrate it for you that has a unique and consistent motor pattern for it. But I think that's very important. But these are all single words, access to phrases and sentences, and spelling and keyboard should be a part of any system that you are implementing. But obviously, where you're going to introduce spelling is going to be different depending on what skills the individual you're using or using the device with, where they are in the scheme of things. But ideally, they'll have access initially to single words. All right, so these are the features that you consider when you're looking at what communication system is most appropriate for the individual. And to me, one of the most important things is vocabulary. I think that we need to have a strong single word vocabulary, and we talk about core vocabulary versus fringe. You need both. Core vocabulary words are those words that are most frequently used. So they're going to be verbs, they're going to be adjectives and adverbs and pronouns, because those are the words that we, even as adults who use language proficiently, 80% of the words that we use are core vocabulary words, okay? So fringe words are nouns, and nouns we really only use 20% of the time when we're communicating. And so you don't want to start out with just nouns. You want to be sure that you're starting out with verbs and adjectives and adverbs and pronouns. But be sure that you have some fringe vocabulary in there, some nouns. And when I talk about using fringe vocabulary, especially for our individuals that we're introducing language and communication to in the beginning, because they're beginning communicators, the nouns that I choose are going to be very specific to that individual. You know, I'm not going to teach a student who doesn't have a dog in their life. A dog's not going to be the first noun that I teach them. You know, I'm not going to teach them to use a word that is not part of their world. I'm going to look at what they are doing and seeing and hearing and see what words are important to them as far as nouns go. And an example that I often use is when I have 2 granddaughters, and when my first granddaughter was born, the family had a big dog, and his name was Otis. Well, Otis was just like June, my granddaughter's best friend. Everywhere she went, he went. And June could lay on him and read a book, or lay on him and watch television, you know, so that was something that was very important in June's life. And so if I were picking a noun to introduce to June if she were non-speaking, Otis might be a noun that I would use because it was an important part of her life. But for Joe down the street who doesn't have a pet of any kind, then dog or cat wouldn't be the word that I would use. I had an individual who was actually a young teenager who had autism that I was working with, and he had this giant stuffed fish that he carried everywhere. And so one of the first nouns that we used with him was fish, so that he could say fish and his mom would know to go find the fish because he wasn't leaving until he had it. So I call those personal nouns, and I'm very careful when I'm introducing that fringe vocabulary or nouns to an individual to pick nouns that are truly important words to that individual. I don't go in and just teach them 500 nouns that they may or may not ever use, okay? So I choose more core and less fringe, but I definitely choose fringe. I think one of the things that happened in the United States when we first started talking about core is everybody went to, don't ever teach nouns, you're only going to teach these frequently occurring words, and that's really not accurate. We need to be sure that we teach more core frequently occurring words than we do nouns, but be sure that we introduce those nouns as well. So when you're choosing a communication system, you want to be sure that you choose one that's going to allow you to have both core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary as well. Another feature that you really want to consider is voice output. Is it going to have digitized or synthesized speech? I've talked a little bit about that before. The downside of digitized is that if you have to have someone record it, digitized is literally recorded speech. So if you have a system that only has digitized, then you're going to have someone record every word, every message that is on that. And what you want to be sure when you're choosing a voice for an individual is that it fits that person. If you have, you know, a 3-year-old girl, you want to have a voice that sounds like a 3-year-old girl. If you have a 12-year-old boy, you want to be sure that it sounds like a 12-year-old boy. So one of the issues that comes along with digitized speech is, let's say you have a 6-year-old and you have a digitized device with them. You don't want to use the teacher's voice to record it. You don't want to use mom's voice because you want the individual using it to accept it as their voice. And so what you're going to have to do is to find a 6-year-old of the same gender that is not always around this student who can come in and program that. Well, then what happens, you know, let's say you do it and you program in 32 different words on this digitized device, and then you need to add more vocabulary, but the person you had to do the recording for you has moved. Then, now we're going to have to record all of the words again so that the voice sounds the same. That's another downside of digitized. With synthesized, which is computer-generated speech, then you don't have that issue. And then it is a matter of spelling the word and then it's going to produce it. Now, you may have to tweak it a little bit depending on the device as well. Sometimes words don't sound exactly the same with speech generated, but most devices that have speech generated speech will allow you to change the pronunciation of the words as well. All right. Then another feature is access, and that's how they're going to be able to say the words that are on the device. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to a different slide. And then rate enhancement is another one. And rate enhancement is looking at a system and deciding how you're going to store vocabulary so that an individual has access to it. You know, if we had a system that had all of the words that an individual needed to use and they were all one hit, so I push a button and it says that word, your system would be so large you couldn't carry it. So there has to be a way to encode it so that you can have access to more vocabulary with a limited number of buttons as well, okay? When I demonstrate a system for you in a little bit, if you're not familiar with that, that'll make a little bit more sense as well, all right? All right, and the Center for AAC and Autism, which is the center that I'm working with, their philosophy of developing language and communication is that a system that we choose needs to allow an individual who is non-speaking or has limited speech to spontaneously express themselves, okay? It's not going to be pre-stored messages that somebody else thinks they want to be able to say. They're going to have access to a lot of different words and, you know, a lot of different vocabulary. And it also needs to be designed in a way that will allow an individual to produce novel messages. And I know I've said it before, but I just think it's so important. Not pre-programmed messages, but this rich single word vocabulary. We're going to have to teach them what all of those words mean and how to access those words. But then they can take those words and put them together to say what they want to be able to say. And we feel very strongly about that. And we feel like, too, that in that system, all of those words should be a unique and consistent motor pattern. So if I push this button and this button to say go, every time I push this button and this button, it's going to say go. It's not, if I push it, it's not going to say something different at a different time. And that'll be more clear, I think, when I demonstrate it as well. All right, so let's talk a little bit about access. You know, if you can have a beautiful communication device, you can have a beautiful picture board if you want, but if an individual can't access it, I mean, they can't touch it to either push the button or show you what picture they're talking about, then they can't use it. It's not going to be very helpful for them in communicating. And so we look at access from two different standpoints. We have direct access, and then we have indirect access. Direct access is when you physically can reach out and push the button or touch the picture, so you have physical contact with it. And if you can't have physical contact with it, then you can have what we call head pointing. And head pointing is when you have a system that will allow you, usually you wear a dot on your forehead or on your glasses if they wear glasses, just depending. But then there's an infrared beam that comes out of the communication system that's going to follow that dot. And so then when they move their head, it will move the cursor across the screen. And then when they hold the cursor on one place on one button for a designated amount of time, then it would access that word. So even if you can't physically reach out and push the button, then technology allows you to use head pointing as well. And again, an individual is going to have pretty good head control to do that. You know, it's not very far. It's only going to be the size of a device. So it's not like they have to turn their head really far, but they're going to have to be able to move it enough to make that cursor move all over the screen to be able to communicate. And oftentimes you may have to start with only a few buttons. But again, I really like a system that is going to allow you to hide buttons, not start with just 2 keys and then add more, because every time you do that, they're going to have to learn a new motor pattern, and we don't want them to have to do that. So anyway, that's head pointing. And then technology now is sophisticated enough too that we can use eye gaze. So that is when someone literally, and again, it's a specific piece of equipment that is attached to a communication system or either is built into it, so that you literally can look at the icon or the picture that you want to choose. And if you hold your gaze there long enough, it will access it. Okay, that is all direct access. Direct access also could be, if you had head control, then you could wear, you know, a hat on your head that had a stick that came out so that you could actually touch the device as well. But all of those are direct access, and direct access is the most desirable way to access a communication system, because it is the fastest, okay? Because you're directly selecting what it is you want to be able to say with that, with the system. That's not possible for everybody. For individuals who have significant motor impairments, they're going to probably need to do something like indirect access if one of the direct access, like head pointing or eye gaze, won't work for them. And that means that your system is going to actually scan, like let's say you have a system that has 84 words on it. then your system will be set up so that it will highlight one row at a time. And then when it gets to the row where the word is you want, you would hit a switch. And these buttons at the bottom are just some photographs, examples of what switches might look like if you're not familiar with that. But a switch can just be plugged into the communication system, and then you set your device to scanning, and you have lots of options in scanning as well. You can do circular, where it just goes around the device. You can do linear, that's when it goes row by row by row. Group is when, let's say you have 84, then it does 1/4 at a time until it gets where you want, then you're gonna hit your switch. And when we go through this, if that's something that y'all would like to see, if you've not seen that before, I can pull it up and demonstrate it for you as well. So, just let me know. But indirect access, while it is slow, if your individual really struggles with being able to access a button, then indirect access may be what they have to go to. And I have had individuals, I've had friends over the years that were incredibly quick at scanning once they learned how to do it. I had a friend who was an adult who had cerebral palsy and was really compromised as far as her abilities to go, her abilities to use her hands. Her only reliable movement was her finger like this. And so what we did was we put her switch right here that was attached to her communication system, and then she would hit the switch this way to scan. But boy, was she fast. I mean, she would just make it, she had it set so that it scanned through the system very quickly, and she could click it, click, and was very quick at it. Another individual that I worked with had a switch at their foot. And again, she was very fast with it as well. I could never scan as fast as she did. And she had cerebral palsy, but that's what worked for her. And she could communicate. She got a college degree using her communication system by scanning. So while direct access is our first choice because it is more accurate and it's just easier and more direct, indirect access using a switch or two switches is certainly something that should be an option for someone who can't access it in a more direct way. Okay. All right, so I have a couple of case studies, and this first one is of a young lady named Renee, and Renee has cerebral palsy. She's 3 years old. And her cerebral palsy gave her very limited ability to access. So she was having difficulty with direct access. She did have a few word approximations that actually took us a while to realize that she really was saying a couple of words because they were not articulated very clearly. But after being around her, we realized she was saying a few things. What we did find out, though, was she had very good receptive language. She could understand what people were saying. She just couldn't express anything. And so what we tried with her initially was we went in and we looked at eye gaze on the communication system. We looked at head pointing and eye gaze. We had access to high-end technology that would allow her to do that. And we really worked hard on giving her access through head pointing or eye gaze. Her eye gaze with the communication system, the high tech, just wouldn't work. And so what we found was that we had to come back, we had to step back and do a more low tech system with her. So I don't know if you can see it or not. Hopefully you can see my cursor right here. The teacher, Tracy, is actually holding a piece of plastic that's just made out of clear Lexan, and it has icons or pictures in each corner of it. And so we went back and said, okay, let's see if we can get her to use access. Remember, she's only 3 years old. So let's see if she can use eye gaze to look at the picture that she wants to indicate to the teacher. And we found that she actually was very good at that. So then we spent a good bit of time teaching her how to access using a low-tech device, but with the hopes that we would go to a high-tech device with her, because she really needed a significant amount of vocabulary because she had it receptively, she just couldn't produce it. And so what Tracy would do, her teacher, she had different boards for different activities they were doing in the classroom. This one is clear Lexan, like I said, with 4 pictures on it. And so the idea is that Renee would first look at Tracy. The middle of the board is open. So we taught her to look straight at Tracy. And then if Tracy would say, you know, she has 4 choices, what is it you want? And then Renee would look at one of the pictures. Well, where's my cursor? Here we go. Would look at one of the pictures and then look back at the teacher. Okay, so that's how she knew. That was affirmation for Tracy, the teacher. When Renee would look at her, she would look to a picture and then look back at the teacher. Then the teacher knew that's what she was trying to indicate. And boy, did she start really generating some language that way. And still, we were still working on getting her to eye gaze as well. And so her biggest obstacle was physically not being able to access the pictures. And she really wanted to. I mean, she would try to get to them with her hand, but her hand just didn't work quite well enough for her to be able to do that. So the strategies for Renee, we knew that she needed an increased expressive vocabulary. She understood a lot of what we said to her, but we needed to give her a way to say what it was she needed to say. And so she needed to be able to gain attention. If she wanted the teacher or some, you know, the teacher assistant in the class or one of her friends to come over, she needed vocabulary that would allow her to gain that attention. So she needed to be able to say, Miss Tracy, you know, come over here, I need something. She also needed to increase her vocabulary with objects and actions so that she could request, so she could direct, so she could comment, so she could describe. She knew all of that. She had that language in her head, but she needed a way to do it expressively. So we knew that she was requesting something. We knew she wanted to comment on something or describe something. And then we needed to be sure that she had increased vocabulary and so that she could reject and accept. So she could say yes, no, but so she could accept and reject other things as well. So our primary goal for her was to increase her expressive vocabulary so she could say the things that she wanted to say. But that, you know, her physical disability was what was in our way, really trying to get her to use a high-tech system, because that was going to give her the most vocabulary and the most independent vocabulary, because as long as she had to rely on the teacher holding that communication, the low-tech device, then, you know, she would have to have a way to let the teacher know which one of those she needed to hold for. So we really were working to get her to use the high-tech system. And then she exited our program and moved to a different city. So we didn't quite get there with her, but our goal was to get her to a system, a more high-tech system, okay? All right, so next is Hakeem, and Hakeem was a 4-year-old. And to give you a little history on Hakeem, I had actually been, that's me and without gray hair. I was younger then. I had been Hakeem's therapist for a whole semester, all of fall semester with this particular school year that this video was taken that I'm going to show you. And I had used sign language with Hakeem. He had a diagnosis of autism and was non-speaking. And he really didn't have language. He didn't understand words and he couldn't produce words. But I had been his therapist for a whole semester and I had used sign language with him. I had tried using sign language, lots of different sign language words with him to get him communicating, and I got nowhere. He didn't use any signs that I was trying to introduce to him. And then I also tried a Big Mac. A Big Mac is just one big button that has one message on it. You can program one word, you can program a phrase, but it's only one message. And so I tried using that with him. He would just slap at it. It really had no meaning for him. And so when we came back spring semester to start back to class, I thought, you know what, I'm going to go to high tech with him. I'm going to give him a device that has a unique and consistent motor pattern for the words that I'm going to teach him. And it's going to have voice output, and we're going to do activities that he loves to do. And I saw immediate improvement with him. I mean, he really seemed to get it. And this is the video that I'm going to show you here is actually the second session where I have gone to a high-tech device that had a unique and consistent motor pattern. And so in the video, we are blowing bubbles. One of his favorite activities is to blow bubbles. And so I have the word more on the system. And all he has to do is to hit that word, and it will say the word, we'll hear the word, and then he sees what happens, okay? Now, also, I have made the picture pretty big, and I put a red background on it, and I had a key guard on it. I wanted to do everything I could to make Hakeem be successful. And so I've set it up that way. So let's watch this little video of Hakeem. And remember, this is only the second day that we have done this. And I spent a whole semester and couldn't get him to do signs or anything. So let's watch.
More bubbles. Go. More bubbles. More bubbles. More bubbles. More bubbles.
Now you see how that little bit of a lag there? It's like, well, maybe I can change him to do a different activity.
Want to bounce? Oh, you want more bubbles. I see. You were looking. More bubbles.
All right, so with that, what was happening in that segment too, is I'm teaching him the word more so he can request more of objects or actions. And so the action he's requesting is to get more bubbles. But what I, as a clinician, know too, is that I can't just use the word more when I am teaching, I can't just use the word more with only bubbles as the activity, because then what does Hakeem think the word more means? He thinks it means bubbles. And so I know that I have to be able to switch activities so that he can learn that more means more than just getting more bubbles. It can be, getting more bouncing. It could be getting more of a snack cracker, that kind of thing. So I had to switch it. And so that's what I was trying to do towards the end of that video. He was very clearly requesting more. He would push the button, he would hear the word, and then he would look at me, expecting me to blow more bubbles. So he got it. This is, day 2. And he already has figured out that if I request more, she's going to blow more bubbles for me. But I know that I need to do more with other activities. So that's why when I saw a little break in the communication between he and I, it's like, well, maybe now I can introduce another activity. I also know that he loves to bounce on the therapy ball. But when I pulled the ball over there to put him on it, he went right back over to, he said more and went back over to the bubbles. And so I knew then that was not the best time for me to change that activity, because he wanted to keep doing bubbles. So I kept doing it for a while. But in the back of my mind, I'm going, I've got to do another activity or he's going to think more means bubbles. So then I come back in a little bit and another clinician comes in the room with me. We're able to transition him to the ball and bounce him. And so this is him still requesting more, but it's a different activity.
More bubbles. All right, let's try something different. Let's try bouncing. Let's try bouncing. Okay, here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4.
You can see, you hear his laughter, his joy, so he loves that activity, but I had to be careful how we transition.
You want to bounce more? 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. And stop. One, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Stop.
All right, so you get the idea there. I gave him a different opportunity with a different activity though, okay? All right, so what about strategies for Hakeem? Well, obviously we need to give him more vocabulary. What he wasn't ready for yet though was a whole screen of pictures, because You know, I tried having all of the buttons on the device show, and then it was very confusing for him. So I have to start with a little bit of vocabulary, but I also want to be sure that I'm staying with that unique and consistent motor pattern. So I'm going to only show a little bit of vocabulary, but as I add it, I'm not going to move anything around. It's going to stay in the same place. But I need to increase his vocabulary for requesting, directing, getting attention, for rejecting, accepting, all of the different functions of language. I want to give him vocabulary for. With an emphasis on core vocabulary, but yes, I want to be sure that I have some fringe nouns in there for him as well. And the key with Hakeem is I've got to use highly motivating activities. You know, I can't just do the same activity with him every time, and I have to be sure that I pick activities that I know he wants to be engaged in. And we can tweak that a little as we go, but in the very beginning, I think it's really important for us to choose activities that are of interest to the students. And I think that too drives what vocabulary we should be using as well. And then I also want to be sure that I allow him to practice those words in a variety of activities, environments, and settings throughout the day as well, okay? All right, one more case study, and this is a little guy named Jack. And Jack is 3 years old as well, and he has a diagnosis of apraxia. And for those that might not know what apraxia is when you don't have voluntary control of a muscle group. So if you're thinking about somebody with apraxia of speech, then they're not able to make their mouth say the words that they want to be able to say. It may be that they understand and they have words, but they just can't make their mouth say it. And that's exactly what was going on with Jack. He had good receptive language skills, but he couldn't make his mouth say the words that he wanted to. He had a few word approximations, but you had to really be in tune and listen to them to realize that they were word approximations. So what he needed really was a large vocabulary, and we needed to teach him lots of words as well. So let me show you this little video. And this is the first day that Jack has seen a communication system. It's the first time he's ever been introduced to one. And so this is just a little snippet of how that was going with him.
All right, what color? What color are we going to use?
So we're blowing up balloons, and he gets to pick what color. And I've already demonstrated to him where that vocabulary is. And he has to put two words.
All right, let's put the red one on.
He has to hit two buttons to say.
On. All right, are we ready? It's getting, ooh. All right, are we ready? What are we gonna do? It came right back. Are we gonna do it?
So I'm modeling for him so he can learn his vocabulary. But you can see he has colors at the top, so he has to do it two icons.
Okay, very good.
And then he looks back to see what colors he has and then makes a choice as to which one he wants.
Oh, wow. All right, are we ready? Ooh, that's pretty big. Are we ready?
Now I'm waiting for him to tell me what to do.
Go.
You ready to go? Are we going to do it again?
Breathe.
All right, so there he selects it again. So what he had on that device was Words for Life, which is a vocabulary. And you could see there are 84 buttons showing, and he was on the full version, which meant he had to hit 2 icon sequence, sometimes 3 icons or 3 picture sequences to say a word. But what I love about this system is that when he learned to say the word go, he goes from, you can see the green button right there in the photograph, that's where go starts. So he hit this one and then he had to hit another one on the other side. But every time he did that, it said go. It didn't change. The pictures didn't change. And then for colors, he starts with a picture of a rainbow and then goes to a row that has all the different colors in it. So then he could choose what color he wanted. All right. So what Jack needed was obviously to increase his expressive vocabulary. He's got that rich single word vocabulary receptively, but he can't produce it with his mouth. So we need a system that will allow him to develop, to be able to develop a vocabulary. We need to increase his vocabulary use of language functions. So again, I'm not just going to teach him nouns. I want to teach him to request, to reject, to comment, to direct, all of the functions of language. I want to be able to teach him in that single word vocabulary. And then once he has learned to expressively produce 50 to 75 words, then I want him to start putting words together to make phrases. But we don't get to that until they have at least 50 to 75 words in there that they can spontaneously use to communicate with as well. Okay. All right. So these are, those were the strategies for Jack. And now these are just general strategies for beginning communicators. I want to be sure that my student is at a readiness to learn state. And these are actually key elements of language acquisition through motor planning, which is a method of intervention in augmentative communication. And so I'll plug here the workshop on Friday as well. Friday, the workshop, July 3rd, is going to be language acquisition through motor planning. And these are strategies that are a part of that communication system, but I think it is a robust way of teaching language and communication to individuals who are non-speaking, okay, who have autism or developmental disabilities. And really, I've even seen it be very robust for adults as well. But readiness to learn, we want to be sure that they're ready to be engaged, because we have to jointly engage with them in order for us to teach them language. Using a unique and consistent motor pattern in the vocabulary, I think, is key. Having the auditory signal, that's what was missing when I would do sign language, because when I would do sign language, the auditory signal came from me, not from my students, because my students couldn't produce it. And so by being able to push a button on a communication system, they produce the auditory signal, which I think is key. Then natural consequences. If I say eat, then you get something to eat. If I say go, something needs to go. And then teaching vocabulary. We want to be sure that we use both core vocabulary and fringe vocabulary as well, okay? All right, and I think it's important too that when we are introducing communication, a communication system, whatever system that is for individuals, that we need to be sure that we have fun with it, because that, what we know, and scientists tell us that it takes about 400 repetitions to create a new synapse, you know, so that something becomes a habit, becomes a motor pattern for them, unless you're using play, and then it only takes 10 to 20. You know, so when I was playing with bubbles with Hakeem, because that was a fun thing that he enjoyed doing, I didn't have to have him do it 400 times before it actually started creating that motor pattern in him. We only did it a few times, and you could even see, you know, he went right to that word. He didn't have to look for it. He went straight to that more word to request more of that. And so making it fun, I think, is very important. Ginsberg is an individual who wrote an article in our ASHA Leader, which is a magazine published by our National Organization for Speech Pathologists. And she said, focus on fun and words will follow. And she's exactly right. Make it fun. And that goes back to choosing what vocabulary is going to be best for an individual as well. So pick vocabulary that children want and need, and they're going to use that vocabulary. All right. And then next is myths about augmentative communication. And I think this is huge, because I see this, you know, I've been a therapist for a long time. I go out into school districts and I meet with families all the time. I meet with administrators, and I find that these myths are still around, but there is lots of research that shows us these are myths and are not things that we should believe in anymore. Okay. So first is that augmentative communication, or AAC, is a last resort in speech language intervention. And I can tell you, as an old clinician, I used to practice that. When I first started seeing a child, if they were non-speaking, I would try all of the intervention methods I knew, and when they failed, then I would introduce augmentative communication. Well, what research is showing us now is that actually augmentative communication should be a first line of intervention with an individual who is non-speaking. And so instead of waiting until we've tried everything else, if you have a student who's non-speaking, introduce augmentative communication to them right out of the gate, because I think you'll see better results if you do that. So the next myth is that augmentative communication will hinder or stop further speech development. And I can tell you from experience, but also from research, that introducing voice output and augmentative communication often will facilitate natural speech more quickly than other methods of intervention. I've seen it happen time and time again. And not every student, not every individual can produce natural speech, but if we start with augmentative communication to begin with, then I think there's a greater chance that they will develop natural speech if they're physically able to do that. But it will not hinder them developing natural speech. And I think that's very important. You know, as a mom, as a grandmom, I want my child, my grandchildren to be able to use natural speech to communicate, but I also don't want to hold them back. Let me go ahead and introduce augmentative communication to them, because A, it may help facilitate that speech, but if not, then they're still learning language and learning how to communicate, and which is going to lead to better outcomes for them in general, okay? But it does not stop further speech development. In fact, I have had numerous cases of individuals who we introduced communication devices to at young ages. We had one little boy that we introduced at age 2. He had apraxia, and it took us about almost 2 years. But he actually left our program after 2 years because he had gone from not being able to say any words at all with his mouth to being able to communicate like a typical 4-year-old should. And then he went into a typical 4-year-old. And his mom will even tell you, I don't think it would have happened without the voice output device, because he had been getting to traditional speech therapy before we saw him for like 9 months, and he could not produce a single sound. But then once we started using the communication system, after about 3 months, we saw him developing some word approximations, and they just got better and better. Now, we persisted with the communication system until he got to the point where he truly could communicate like a typical 4-year-old. He was putting 5, 6, 7 words together, which his doctor said he would never be able to do. And now he's perfectly verbal. And I really do think using the communication system is what got us there with him. So another myth is that children have to have a certain set of skills to be able to benefit from augmentative communication. And what we know now is that's not true. They don't have to come to us with, we can even start at the cause and effect level. They don't have to be able to read. They don't have to be able to identify pictures. It's more about, we start where they are. Let's teach them how to use their motor pattern to say this word, and then what happens when they say this word. So they don't have to be at a certain skill level. Another myth is that speech generating devices are only for children who have intact cognition. And I would argue that if you have an individual who is non-speaking, if they can't tell you what they know, then we probably really don't have a good idea of what their cognitive skills are, because how do we tell people what we know? I mean, how do people know what we know? We tell them. And so we don't have to wait. We don't have to say, well, he has to have an IQ of this or that. We're going to start where he is, and then hopefully teach him. And research is showing us that we don't have to have a certain IQ in order to introduce augmentative communication to an individual. Another myth is that children have to be at a certain age to benefit from augmentative communication. We used to think they had to be at least 8 years old. What we now believe is the younger the better. We really should start individuals who are non-speaking at age 12 months. Let's put them on a communication system then, because that's when they typically should be developing speech. So let's go ahead and start them early. So don't wait. Start as early as you can. That's not to say if you have a 10-year-old who's non-speaking that it's too late, because it's not. I have seen individuals who started late. I actually have a friend who is 34 and only got his communication system when he was 32. He has autism, and he communicates beautifully with his system. And so, you know, if you don't start early, don't be discouraged and think that you can't, but start them early, because there is benefit to that. And then the last myth is that there's a representational hierarchy of symbols, that you have to start with objects and then work your way to printed words. And research tells us we don't have to do that. And I think the reason that we don't is because we do have voice output. You can push a button and it says the word. And so you don't have to start with certain words, if you will. I mean, with objects. You don't have to have a real cookie if you're talking about a cookie, or a real ball if you're talking about a ball. And I think we can just start with symbols. And if you're using a device that has a unique and consistent motor pattern, in the beginning, the symbols aren't even that important, because it's going to be pushing the button that is the part that's going to get them the reaction that they're going to learn from. So, but those are myths that surround augmentative communication. They have for a long time, and they're still there. But know that research says that all of these are myths and are not things that that we should be practicing, or you know, saying this is the way we need to be able to do things. There's a reference page at the end of my PowerPoint that has the reference for this article if you want to look at it as well. All right, and this is just kind of in summary. You know, for individuals who are non-speaking, augmentative communication isn't a choice, it's an obligation. And it should never be a question of whether we try something or try something again, but only what do we do next? You know, what do we try next? We need to really work to give individuals who are non-speaking a way to communicate, because having language and being able to communicate is what connects us with the world. That's how we make friends and keep friends. So we want to be sure that we're providing them with what they need to be able to participate in life. And then lastly, Gail Van Tatenhove is an internationally known speaker in the area of augmentative communication. And she has this little quote that she uses, and I think it is so appropriate. And she said, you have to learn to communicate before you can communicate to learn. And I think that's something for us to think about. You know, we really do need to be sure that we're teaching them how to communicate, and then they can use those communication skills to learn even more. But we have to start with communication, because I think that's the key. Okay. So any questions? Are we at a point where we're ready to ask questions? I can't hear you.
You're mute.
Yeah.
Thank you, Janie. Amazing presentation, and there are loads of questions for you.
Oh, good, good.
If you can stop your screen share, then we'll be able to see a bigger picture of you.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll start first with the questions on Hakeem. There were a few questions that some of them had on Hakeem. So first, what was the device that Hakeem was using?
Okay, that actually is a Vantage Lite, and it's actually an older device. What took its place is the Accent series that I talked about. And, you know, there's a small one and a big one. I've got one. Let me hold it up real quick. This is
Janie, can you stop sharing your sharing screen, please?
Oh, all right, hang on. I've got to go to big picture.
No worries. Take your time.
Just click on stop screen share.
Just go to the share screen and stop sharing.
Oh, I can do it up here. Thank you.
Yes, there you are.
See, I know this when there's not 50 people watching me, right? So sorry. Is that okay? Am I good now?
Yes, yes.
All good.
All right. So this is the accent. Oh, hang on. I got in a different mode. This is the device that took the place of the Vantage Light. The Vantage Light was, just an earlier example of this, but this is what we're using now instead of the Vantage Light, but that was a Vantage Light. Okay.
Okay. And was Hakeem tried using any low-tech AAC or something like PECS or Macathon Science before we went to low-tech AAC devices?
We did sign language with him. I mean, I really stressed sign language with him because I was a big believer in using sign language, and he just wouldn't do it. And one of the reasons I think he struggled with it was because he has apraxia. His main diagnosis was autism, but he had some limb apraxia as well. And so I think he physically couldn't form, the signs that we were using. I did use some picture devices with him, and he just didn't seem to connect. And it was not until I introduced him to voice output that it was like the light bulbs just went off for him. But we did try some low tech stuff first.
How would you move from a basic communicative functions like requesting or rejecting to what the questions of social reasoning or inferring task? Is there any test of batteries that we follow to assess AAC?
There are a couple of instruments that we have used, the communication matrix, and it's actually a free assessment instrument that you can get on the internet. And I don't know, I'll get that information for you, but I think if you just went on the internet and search for communication matrix, that's one instrument that allows you to, it's kind of like you take a language sample and then you see what kind of vocabulary they have. And then the Quad Pro is another instrument that looks at vocabulary, it looks at syntax, it looks at morphology, it looks at pragmatics with your student. But, my thought is it's no different than teaching language. You're going to teach single word vocabulary first with multiple functions, not just requesting. Sometimes we start with requesting because it's just easy for that beginning communicator to go, oh, more, and I get something more that I really like. But you really want to be sure that you're teaching more than just requesting. You want to teach other kinds of language functions as well. You want to be able to teach them to direct. And you can do that simply as well. You can teach, it's like with Jack in the video with him, I taught him how to say go. So then he was not requesting, he was directing me to let go of the balloon so it would fly into the air because that's what he liked, So I think you want to teach vocabulary, then you're not going to start with morphology to begin with because you want to get them, have a pretty big vocabulary, 75 to 100 words before maybe you're adding an S for plurals and things like that, but you're still going to follow along in that natural language development sequence. Teach the vocabulary, then put words together, then you're going to add, so then you're targeting syntax, you're targeting morphology and pragmatics as well. So does that answer?
Yes. Okay. How do you, can you just give us some highlights of French words? You talked about French words in the initial part of your book.
Yes. French words are going to be nouns, and those are going to be the ones that I choose first are going to be the ones that are important to that individual. Okay. Like here's an example. I had one young man who was in his early 30s that I was evaluating for the first time for a communication system. He had never had one before, had cerebral palsy. And so I was doing requesting with more and directing and really not getting anywhere. I really couldn't tell if he really was understanding and doing what I needed him to do. Well, his mom came with him. He spends every day with his mom. She's his caregiver. He's not in school anymore. He's home with her all the time. And so I had the thought, well, what if I switched to using a noun? What about the noun mama? Because that's what he would have called her. And so I programmed mama on the system. And then we made a big deal of shooing mom out of the room, telling her she has to go and she can't come back until he would call her. And so then as soon as she got out of the room, he pushed the button to say mama, and she ran back in, you know, and it was joyful and he enjoyed it. So 2 times, and he knew how to say mama to get her to come back in the room. And then daddy called on mom's cell phone. And so we programmed daddy on there. And so then he could go back and he could, you know, he could call dad or he could call mom, either one. And so that was a fringe vocabulary word because that's a noun, both of them, mama and daddy, but they were important to him. And so that was a great place to start, you know. But, you know, another example is if your individual has a favorite food. I was doing a training one time and did just a little bit of training on the device, and the mom said, well, I want to be able to say corn dog quickly. And so I go through this whole thing, you know, how I'm a trainer. I think I know what I'm talking about. As I said, well, you can say corn and you can say dog. And so here's a 3-icon sequence to say corn and a 3-icon sequence to say dog. And then you hit the message window and he can say corn dog. And she said, you don't understand. If he needs a corn dog and wants a corn dog, he wants it now. It's like, I get it. So then we went in and programmed it because that was a fringe word that was important and made mom and his life better because he could easily say corn dog. So ultimately you're going to teach a lot of nouns, but you want to start with nouns that are important to that particular individual, and that's going to be different with everybody. And so look in their life and see what words they need, because I really do believe if we pick the words that our individuals that are not speaking want and words that they need, they're going to use them. And sometimes that is going to be fringe. And so that's going to be any noun that is important to that individual.
Correct. I like to share that one of the kids that I worked with cerebral palsy, a 14-year-old, had absolutely no speech, very limited control over body, severe dystonia, didn't even have a good head control. And so what I did was, on her glasses, I attached the red light, the flashlight that we do use it as a pointer. Mm-hmm. And we attached a small device here onto her glasses. And on a A3 size of a sheet, in 4 corners, we gave her options. And we had, of course, to the liking that she needed. And all she had to do was, at the right answer, she had to look up and, you know, put that pointer to that location.
Right.
So it just did not help us increase her communication, but also worked up on her head control, you know, with her neck exercises. Mm-hmm. It really helped her a lot. In fact, for the first time in the school, she stood first in a class at 7th standard and 7th grade, because now the teachers could understand what she wanted to communicate.
Right. And I've used that very technique before. And one of the things that I do, if I know that this is going to be an individual that's probably going to have to go to head pointing eventually, and hopefully I'll get them to a sophisticated system, but when they're real young, is we'll just play games even with the flashlight. And we'll shine them, you know, okay, what do you want me to shine it on? I'll shine it on the teacher. I'll shine it on the door, you know, and then eventually go to having that little laser pointer like you would use to point to a screen on their glasses or on a hat or whatever, and let them use it because it helps them be able to understand it, which eventually may lead to a more sophisticated device. So yes, I've done that many times. It's a good strategy.
Thank you, Janie. Janie, they just wanted to know the name of the device that you were talking about. The device that you showed earlier.
The one that the accent, and this one is actually an Accent 1000, and it is by the Print Keramik company. It may be by the Liberator company in India. I know y'all have access to the vocabulary words for life, and I think that is Liberator a company that does business in India?
I'm not sure, guys. Anybody is aware of it? Do y'all want to unmute yourself and talk?
What is it called?
The Liberator. It's the European version of the Print Keramik company.
I think I had heard about this.
Yeah. So
I've heard about something to do with India. Yes.
And the Words for Life vocabulary that I mentioned too comes on the Accent series if you're looking at a dedicated device, but it's also on an iPad app. So you can purchase it from the App Store just like you can any app. And I know it's available for y'all as well.
Okay. So instead of looking at an app, can we, actual instrument, can we use the iPad? There are a lot of apps on the iPad which provide communication softwares. Would you recommend any that is that you feel is good?
My favorite is Words for Life. Because it kind of fits all of those elements that I was talking about as far as a unique and consistent motor pattern. The screen doesn't change on it. It stays the same. And the beauty of it is that you could hide and show as well. So let me pull my, I have the iPad right here. So let me just show you real quick. I like it because it has a unique and consistent motor pattern. It has a lot of vocabulary, but you can also, well, of course I had turned it off, so I wouldn't be using Wi-Fi, the Wi-Fi signal. So it'll take, I can show it on here because it's the same. It looks exactly like this vocabulary. Can y'all see that, or is there a glare?
Yeah, we can see.
All right, so this vocabulary, this is one hit. So if I hit one button, like if I wanted to say go, I can do it there. If I want to say more, if I want to say stop, if I want to say eat, that vocabulary is all there. Obviously, when you're starting, and this is one of the things that we're going to talk about in the training on July the 3rd, this may be too many buttons for an individual who's a beginning communicator, but you can quickly turn on Vocabulary Builder and then well, if I weren't on in front of everybody, I could quickly turn it on, right? Let me see if my device has come up yet. That's not working the way I wanted it to. Okay, here we go. This is the vocabulary. All right, and then if I wanted to, I can turn on Vocabulary Builder. So this has everything showing. All right, so I can actually choose what vocabulary I want to show. So instead of having all of the buttons showing, I can have one button showing, I can have 3, I can have 4, whatever I want, so that I teach those words and then I add more vocabulary to it. And so that's one of the reasons that I like it, is it's easy to change. But as I add buttons, you still have that unique and consistent motor pattern, so that my students not having to relearn a motor pattern for a word once they've learned it.
So Janie, can I request you to make a list of such apps and devices that you can send to us, and then we can try and see if some of them can be available to our members and participants.
Yes.
So one question was from a parent. This is a more general question. She is asking how to break echolalia, and use it to build further language for a 7-year-old child on the spectrum.
Say that again.
How to break echolalia and use it to build further language for a 7-year-old child on the spectrum.
What I have found with students, and I have worked with a lot of students who had echolalia, is that when you start teaching those single words on a communication system, that they actually sort of transition away from using echolalia. If you're teaching them how to say the word on the device and then responding to that, and then even if they say it with naturally speaking and how you respond to it's actually going to shape their way of using it. So a lot of times the echolalia just kind of goes away because they're beginning to attach meaning to the words instead of just repeating it.
Okay, sounds good. It's very challenging for a speech pathologist to convince parents to start AAC for their child. Can you suggest some tips?
Okay. And yes, it is. And, you know, think about it from a parent standpoint. Of course, we want our children to be able to use natural speech. But I think what is so important is for us to help families understand that by using this device, you may more quickly and get to natural speech with your student. And it's certainly not going to prevent it. And there's lots of research that says if you introduce voice output, it's not going to keep them from developing natural speech. If anything, it's going to help natural speech come along quicker. And so I think we have to really just encourage them that way. And I think, you know, one of the best things we can do is to show them success. And so even if, you know, say, let's use this as a method of intervention right now, and let's see what happens. And I think when they start seeing that their child can now communicate, then that's going to help them be convinced better. Yes, you know, this communication system might be the right way to go. And then if they start developing natural speech, then you win, you know, then everybody wins, really.
Color coding of those apps items are in accordance to syntax, semantics, and do we have any certification coming up for LAMP and AAC?
Okay, first of all, the color coding is based on the Fitzgerald key, which was a key that was used with hearing impaired students and that kind of thing. But like all of the pronouns are yellow, the verbs are green. And we don't teach that to our students. That's really more for us to kind of see how it's organized and that kind of thing. And as far as certification as in LAMP, the only certification right now is to become a LAMP certified professional. And that is where you register to do that. And then you videotape yourself implementing the LAMP method of intervention. And then you'll have a mentor that will review those videotapes and give you tips. And, you know, basically you just have to prove that you know how and can implement LAMP. And then you can be certified. Not a lot comes with certification other than you can say if people are looking for a LAMP certified professional in your area, then you'll be advertised on the website as being one that could help families with the LAMP method of intervention. So did I answer all of that question?
Yes. And the last one, there was a question, do we use, I know you said this in your presentation, can we use AAC devices with children with intellectual deficits, with children with low intelligence?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I would say, I mean, I'm a strong believer in this because I think almost regardless of what their IQ or their intellect is, I think they can learn to communicate. And really, you know, if they only can communicate 10 words is better than no words. You know, that's 10 things that they can communicate. But I had one young man who came to me, he was middle school age, and they said he had an IQ of 12. And he walked into the room and, you know, I greeted him. He greeted me back. I told him to sit at the table. He did. And I'm thinking, I think his IQ is higher than 12 or he couldn't do those things. And he learned to be a competent communicator using his communication system. And then they realized that he really didn't have that low of an IQ, because then he had a way to tell people what he knew, you know. So yes, absolutely. You can use it with children who have intellectual disabilities.
So last question from Soumya. Please advise us on communication generalization with AAC devices. How do we move to generalized communication?
Say that again.
how do you move to generalized conversation with AAC devices?
By teaching all of the things that you teach in language, you want to teach vocabulary, single word vocabulary. I think that is key, because then they can put words together to say what they want to say. So that's why you want to teach a lot of core vocabulary. You want to teach pronouns, you want to teach verbs, you want to teach adverbs, you want to teach adjectives as well, and then teach them how to put those words together to make phrases. And then once they can make phrases, then you're going to teach them to put, you know, the S for plural or for possessive or past tense and that kind of thing. And along with that, you're going to be teaching them pragmatics, how to take a conversational turn. What happens if I say a word and then you say a word, then how do you come back and add to that conversational piece? So I think you do it just like you would be doing if you were teaching conversational skills to an individual who was using speech. I don't think it's any different. The only difference is you're using a piece of technology for them to produce those words. But I think in order to get to that level, you have to use voice output. And I think that you have to use a system that gives you a rich single word vocabulary. And I know I've said that 1,000 times in the last hour and a half, but I really firmly believe it. I worked with a lot of students and individuals of all ages, and the ones who could best engage in a general conversation were individuals who had single word vocabulary access, and they had access to all kinds of words, all kinds of core vocabulary words and fringe words as well.
Great. Thank you, Janie. One last question going. Can you share some articles which suggest the using AAC devices that the child has just started using verbs, just started using words verbally? So can you, or you can share some articles of the research that you talked about in the end?
I can actually. Shall I just send you, when I'm going to do a list of apps, and then can I just send you a list of articles as well?
Thank you. We would really appreciate it. It's been a great session with you.
Okay. Let me write that down.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
And anyone else, if you'd like to make, so I've asked everybody to switch on your camera so you can also see whom you've been talking to. So, and anybody wants to say anything, please unmute yourself and share your comments.
I have a question actually. Can you hear me, ma'am?
Yes.
Yes. So I was treating this adolescent rather with autism, and we used the Proloquo to go with him. So we were at a point where we enhanced his language a lot, but then I was stuck because I didn't understand when to discharge the child from therapy, and when do I say that, okay, his skills are developed up to a level that he can do it himself, or how would I assess him, like pre-therapy and post-therapy, and decide that therapy can be terminated and he would be in a safe position to still communicate on the device by himself? So
I think there are a couple of those instruments that I mentioned, I think are good ones. The communication matrix. I would give him that instrument before you started with therapy, and it's going to look at what, how is he communicating? Is he using words, that kind of thing? And then after you do intervention, I would think about it in the same way with an individual that is using speech. When do you get to where they can communicate on their own and move on? I think if they are clearly using their communication device to interactively communicate with you, and they can generate novel messages, and two, the exploring and learning new vocabulary. I think most every student that I have worked with that really became competent communicators didn't wait for me to teach them all the words, maybe in the beginning, but once they got it and understood that if I push this button, something's going to happen, then they start looking for words on their own. I had one little guy. He wasn't so little. He was actually a high school student, and he was using the device, and we were teaching him specific words. He was doing really well. But then what we started seeing was he would spontaneously use words that we hadn't taught him. his mom came to his class on his birthday and brought a birthday cake, and they had a little party. And then she wanted to take a picture of his classmates, and he wouldn't let her. He just kept pushing the camera away and telling her to go, and that kind of thing. So that night when they got home, she asked him, she said, "Why didn't you want me to take a picture of you when we had your birthday party?" And he went to his device and he said, "Embarrass." We had not taught him how to say the word embarrass, but he found it and understood because he was developing language. And so he understood what that meant. And the same thing happened one day, and he used the word nervous. Well, we hadn't taught him how to say nervous, but he appropriately used it because he had been exploring and listening. And now that he had language, he would hear these words in his environment. And so then when he saw them, it helped him know how to use those words appropriately. So that was kind of a long answer, but did that help?
Yes, it did. Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's a wonderful session. Thank you. Thank you for arranging this. Thank you.
Welcome, Sonakshi.
I had a question.
Okay.
Something about how to handle. So we have this child who is very attracted to devices, gets very fascinated with the lighting, and because there's a lot of auditory seeking or sensitivity, would prefer to keep the device close to the ear. How do you work with such a child to get them to use the AAC device appropriately?
I think just kind of like what we were talking about, and I think if you do the LAMP training on Friday, you'll have some real good ideas on how to do that. But I think, again, the way we learn language is we produce a word, we hear the word, and then we see what happens. So I would pick things that are really motivating to him. If he loves to listen to his device, then let that be what he requests, give him ways to be able to use vocabulary that allow him to do the things he wants to do. And I know in the beginning you're thinking, but I don't want him to keep putting his communication device up by his ear. But let him do it to begin with, and then you can kind of shape that, let him see that he was successful and he controlled it by being able to, whatever word you use, to let him hold it up to his ear to listen, but then teach him another word to do something else that he likes. And I think, to me, that's the real way that you do it, is you pick vocabulary that's powerful for that student and let him use it to get what he wants. And then it's going to be easier. To me, those first 5 or 10 words are the hardest ones to teach when they're really learning the language of it. But then once they have it and they're successful with it, then it's going to be easier to teach them the next words, which are going to be words you more want to teach him, if that makes sense.
Yep. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. We have 20 minutes past our time of the webinar, but thank you. It was an amazing session to have all of you here with us. We wish you well, good night, and be safe. We'll see you back on 3rd of July.
Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Janie.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Excuse me, ma'am, is it the same time that it's going to be conducted on July 3rd?
Yes, it'll be the same time, 7:30 to 9.
Okay, again, I would like to say it was really a wonderful presentation, very, understandable and very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Jane.
See you on 3rd.
Thank you, ma'am. Yeah.